So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here with you today. I do have rather a strange background, beginning in Australia, where I was a teacher and then a teacher trainer working for the government, training teachers, mentoring teachers, and really trying to be a little bit progressive in the area of education. My European career has been in law, in technology, lecturing at the Sorbonne University in law, technology and information systems, which led me to start working with governments in Europe. So let's take a look at education, because the way I'm approaching it is perhaps not what you're used to when you think about EdTech. First of all, we have learning and the learner, but what should we be teaching and why should we be teaching that? Then we have the teaching with the methodology, how, and innovation also comes in here, but it definitely has to echo what the learner is meant to be learning. And thirdly, research, which is extremely important to underpin innovation in both areas. First of all, for the well-being of the learners, also for the safety and the security. Now, you may think, well, what is innovative about looking at what learners are going to learn? Well, I wrote a book called Upon What Does the Turtle Stand back in 2003 and asked 14 countries why they educate. And there are very, very different reasons. Singapore, for example, educates so that young people can be innovative and have a career, a good career. Europe more educates for the well-being of the learner. Now, Poland, and a former Ministry of Education, told us that he believes that the end objective is the environment, that it was going to be very important, and we should learn a lot about how to protect our environment in innovative ways. I think this explains why I begin this way. It's a constant battle for balance. We have values. Values lead society. We need to talk with philosophers, with lawyers, or the legal sector, with sociologists, to maintain those values. And this is one of the big problems of education ministries. How do they maintain the values whilst innovating? But next we have attitudes, the way we educate. The pedagogue, for example. A pedagogue, if we look back in ancient Greece, was just that person, that slave, who used to take young people to the market and teach them about life and things in general. So we have to keep that in mind. Pedagogy, it's leading, psychology, linguistics, all very important. And then the third corner of the triangle is technology. And this is what I think most of you are wanting to focus on today, the AI in education, but also we have to think about design, we have to think about security. And it's a constant battle because education ministries cannot take a jump ahead, then rectify the aim later. They're obliged to be forward thinking. These are push and pull on what we're doing. For example, the pull is the values, trying to make a society by giving kids an equivalent sort of education leading in the same direction. The attitudes are push and pull. We have all sorts of different attitudes at play in society, and then the technology is definitely something that's pushing change in education. And we saw this with the COVID. There are three levers of innovation. The first one is societal transformation. Why is it that we suddenly began using technology, digital technology in schools as a learning platform? Well, we were pushed there by the COVID sanitary crisis, and we're still trying to catch up. The next is the economic political pressure to succeed, to have a healthy economy, and technological progress, which will never stop. And what are the ingredients necessary for successful innovation? As I've mentioned, multidisciplinarity, diversity, but also listening, observing, synthesis, critical thinking, reasoning, problem solving, and one that I hadn't really thought about, oral and written expression, able to share ideas and get people to pick them up. Creativity, of course, entrepreneurship. The World Economic Forum, every 5 years, makes a list of the 10 skills that education systems should be focusing on to prepare young people to thrive in society. If you take a look at these skills, these are pretty much what I just said. Analytical thinking and innovation. And this is for all sorts of jobs, not just for innovators. Active learning, learning strategies, complex problem solving, creativity, originality, initiative, of course, leadership, being able to be a social influencer, use of technology, technology design, resilience, which is very important also for innovators, and reasoning and problem solving. These have hardly changed over the last 5 years, but I think it gives us a good glimpse of what you should be focusing on if you're thinking of innovating and working in EdTech. I belong to a working group called the Dynamic Coalition for Internet Standards, Security and Safety. And over the last few weeks, we've been interviewing industry to try to understand why they keep saying that there's an enormous skill gap. What is this skill gap and how we're going to fill it? In the first column, you see important for industry, and this is all sorts of industry, but with the technology in common. So important is the first column. And have a look at the prevalence in the second column. We can see some huge gaps. Okay, problem solving, agility, flexibility, it's sort of parallel. We're getting there. Ethical understanding, because you cannot innovate if you do not have this ethical understanding. Open-mindedness, importance, 5 on a scale of 5. Degree of prevalence, 2. Snappy report writing, as I mentioned earlier. Critical thinking, both low in prevalence in the education system, high in priority. Forecasting, big picture thinker, and this is something that industry really underlines in the capacity to handle complexity. And yet what our young people are learning at school apparently does not even look at these areas. A holistic approach, apparently we're getting there. Understanding interconnections, and this, I believe, especially in the cybersecurity industry, which is very important for education, is vital. And yet we don't help our young learners understand interconnections, understand ethics, or give them the practice they need in verbal communication. Teamwork also is considered high. We are continuing to work on this. We're continuing to interview industry, Facebook, Twitter, the various industries that I'm working with, to really understand what are the gaps. Why do they keep saying that they can't find the employees they need? I have an interesting career because I've worked for a lot of governments, the Australian government, the government in Luxembourg, the government in Morocco, which I'm currently still working for. But I think that it's also important to look at the semi-governments, because they also are important policymakers. And there we have the European Commission, the Council of Europe, UNESCO, European Schoolnet. And I'm only showing here the various people that I have worked for and with, and where I've gathered the ideas that I'm telling you today. Facebook, I sit on 2 advisory boards for Facebook in the USA. The Safety Advisory Board, but also the Youth Advisory Board, because I think we're all aware that Facebook is probably educating our children as much as schools are. Twitter, I sit on the Trust and Security Council. Huawei are sponsoring a project where we're actually getting magicians to come in and do magic online so that young people can learn things that they need to know to protect themselves online. And for this, we've developed an innovative tool where we can really measure the pulse and know what young people are thinking. And we're having quite remarkable results by this small innovation, designing the message, designing the tools, but asking a magician to deliver it and to add his touch of magic. And I've often worked with Google, and you won't be surprised to hear that the resource most young people used mostly during the COVID lockdown was YouTube. So once again, Google is an educator. I'm going to talk to you today about 3 experiences with the government in Luxembourg, with the Council of Europe, and with Facebook. I learned an interesting model in Israel 20 years ago on how you can really push innovation in a methodological way. To begin with, you have to look at the situation that you're going to tackle. Once you've looked at the situation you're going to tackle, then you look at the goals. Where do you want to be in 2 or 3 years' time? And once you have your current situation and you have your goals, where you're going, then you can plot the path. My experience in Luxembourg was in a task force that was set up by the government, because firstly, OECD scale showed that Luxembourg was about 40th place out of 42 countries, where back in 2001. If you look at where they are today, you see they've made a huge jump. Luxembourg is financial industry. The financial industry needs people fully able to work with technology. There was no university in Luxembourg. Students had to find a place in universities, either in Belgium, France, or Germany. Therefore, they had to be competitive. There's a big reliance on an external workforce. 650,000 people live in Luxembourg today. 350,000 people come into Luxembourg every day from surrounding countries to work. And lastly, of course, there was the huge language challenge, very little online in Luxembourgish, which is a language. Children have to learn to read in German, they learn in French, and therefore that was the other situation to tackle. They decided that they had some very specific goals. The first, and of course it's important to know their goals, the first was to educate children and citizens across the whole country. And we had 3 years to do it, to integrate ICT across the whole country, to equip schools ergonomically, to train teachers, educators, animators, because there are a lot of adults to educate too, respect the language and the culture, use all available resources, and spend a budget wisely, involving all relevant stakeholders. How did they do it? Well, first of all, they decided that this was a problem, not just for the Ministry of Education, but for 6 ministries: health, justice, youth, social affairs. They are all involved in making any modifications, even in other countries. Education involves about 1/4 of our populations normally, and therefore this diversity was important. They had a big dedicated budget, as you can guess. But they said, we have a lot of innovative people here. There are a lot of very good ideas, but are we sure that these good ideas are correctly filtered? Are they able to work? Do people who have ideas, are people who have ideas also able to manage their project? Are they able to evaluate it? And for this reason, they set up a dedicated expert team, a task force. I was in charge of education, research, and culture. The first thing we did was, of course, reach out and see what were these grassroots ideas. Some of them were fantastic. I'm going back 20 years, and yet already they were thinking about doing a thin client server. Teacher forums, bringing teachers together, actually going to classrooms, recording, seeing what's missing, what needed to be done. We also had a suitcase of laptops that we took around to all the country, all the schools in the country. But we didn't just give them a laptop and say experiment. We took the laptops in, and now we're doing this with mobile phones, with 2 teachers. They gave the first lesson. 1 week later, they came back, they shared the lesson with the teacher. 3rd week, they came back and the teacher was on his own. It also helped the school with this very difficult problem of what sort of equipment do you buy? How do you avoid making mistakes? How do you get through this process with business? Because heads of school are not businessmen. But we also had to set up a safety security campaign. Schools have a lot of vital information on their students. Very few schools were aware of encryption and aware of the importance of balancing the technology they bring with security measures. And of course, transparency is absolutely vital for a successful, innovative project. People are concerned. What might be the end results? Where could things go wrong? Communication to public is key, along with stringent project evaluation. That is looking at how we innovated in Luxembourg. And I think if you look up today, you are going to see that Luxembourg is one of the most innovative countries in Europe. The next example I'm going to give is digital citizenship education. And this is something I'm working on for the Council of Europe. And this is a hugely important problem where we do need a lot of innovation. The situation to tackle, well, there is a demise of democracy, and there has been over the last 10 years. I'm sure that you're going to investigate this, but you're going to see there have been a number of studies. We have less of a belief in democracy. It's more or less the social media which pushes us into making the decisions we do. Low public awareness of artificial intelligence and the impact of IT on society. The positioning of values. Parents are scared that the values that they have are no longer valid, that the technology has surpassed them. This is not true. Values are more important than ever. User competences, you would be amazed at how few competences users actually have. We know the programs that we use, but we don't know what's going on behind. National education authorities are challenged by all of this, but they don't know what to do about that top part of the triangle, that is the values, and also the left side, the attitudes. And of course, Europe is complex with all of the languages. COVID was a huge jump in advance. What we learn is just 30% of parents think that technology is having an impact on their children, and a similar number know what it means to be a citizen in today's digital world. Well, we had clear goals: protect human rights, democracy, rule of law. That's what the Council of Europe does. Raise awareness, work with industry to make sure that they have the same view of digital citizenship as what we have. And we've both had to move a little bit so that we know that we're working in the right direction. Respect national culture, language, influence national policymakers, little budget, spend it wisely, and involve all relevant stakeholders. We go about innovation in a different way. although diversity still counts. Of course, people who work in the Council of Europe already come from a number of different countries, but their background is not so different. And most of them who are at the policymaking level have been there so long that they have possibly forgotten what really goes on in life. A dedicated budget, you always need to begin an innovation knowing how much you've got to spend on it, which permits you to know the level of scale you can expect. We did a lot of research on competences, and I can give you links if you'd like to see the competences that are required to be a citizen in a digital world. Fundamental research also on strategies. And from this, we were able to develop a recommendation which has now been adopted by 47 national education ministries on why they should promote digital citizenship, how they can promote digital citizenship, but now we are looking for innovation to get that out into schools. Schools have few resources, few manuals to make this happen. We've done public surveys and interviews to get that bottom-up approach. And we're working with various networks, all of the parent associations in Europe, because they also are involved in education. In fact, they've become the primary educators, so we can't forget their point of view. To create such a movement, such an innovation, you also need very clear guidelines, manuals, videos to ensure that transparency and dissemination, and a stringent project evaluation methodology. My third example is quite different. I enjoy working with industry because they really push you to the forefront with innovation, but also they have to look at policymakers from a different angle. They have to satisfy the government requirements. And if they don't, they very rapidly have governments on their backs because they're not doing the right thing. They have to stay at the innovation forefront. They have to maintain a controversial business model. They have to constantly increase their user base. They have to keep their customers informed and satisfied. And they've got this huge responsibility, or the government, it comes right down onto them, to protect children, to protect the young users. What have they done? And this is general: TikTok, Facebook, Google, anyone, Twitter, anyone you can name, all industry and social media tackles the issue in the same way. One, they bring in international experts. Unfortunately, governments do not want to be part of this usually. I'm probably, out of the 16 international experts on Facebook Safety Advisory Board, I'm probably one of the few that also works a lot with government. They also do a lot of grassroots studies, surprisingly enough, not even mentioning the name Facebook or the name Twitter or whoever is doing the testing, because it's really so important when you're talking about innovation to understand the grassroots and respond to the grassroots. Otherwise, there's no point, because there'll never be any scaling up. They also provide funding grants. Perhaps you've heard, over the last couple of years, Twitter has spent a lot of money in funding grants on health in social media. How do you improve health? Because we hear so many problems about people getting depressed, etc. But when you go to Facebook or any of these organizations, you also see what the environment is for innovation. Big open spaces with lots of people working together, great barbecue pits where you can sit around and brainstorm, 5, 6 restaurants on the premises in Menlo Park, where you want to stay all day and communicate with your colleagues, because no one innovates alone. We always need this input to innovate. They also have a very strong legal base. If you wonder what happens to national prosecutors when they leave their job, well, you'll find many of them in Facebook and certainly in others. And also, whenever we are talking about education, whenever we're talking about safety or security, you will find someone on the panel from social media because they realize their responsibility. They realize that they have to be seen and what they're doing has to be seen. I feel that it's very important to talk about social media because our children spend so much time on it, because somehow we need to bring education and what children do out of school hours much, much closer if we're really going to progress. I'm going to leave you some final thoughts on innovation. First of all, I've said it a dozen times, involve diverse experts from different disciplines and backgrounds. Think out of the box. Overcome that tendency to stay close to what you know. When you look at industry, for example, the circular economy, we did not just take products as they were and decide that we were going to make a circular economy so that there was less wastage. What we did was actually have to redesign those products, the starting point. You cannot change, you cannot introduce innovation without thinking holistically, because it's the domino theory. You get one thing wrong and everything goes wrong down the line. One innovation in education, I'm not sure if you're aware of it, every 10 years or so, we change the way we teach kids to read. We teach them letter by letter, we teach them globally to look at the whole word. We teach orally and symbolically at the same time. We change every 10 years. And I'm sure you've heard time and again, the big problem with this, we don't think holistically. We don't think how it impacts on the way they're getting information, the way they're using information. So keep that domino theory in mind. You have to aim for the tipping point when you innovate, because what's the point of innovating if you're not going to scale it up? I don't know if you're aware of the communication theory, which some people call it the grain of sand. If you really want to scale something up, you have to reach 7% of the population, 7% of the teaching sector, 7% of parents, whatever. And then it will automatically scale up by itself. Watch out for those unexpected secondary effects that can nip innovation in the bud. You always have to test, pilot test, and pilot test again so that you do find those secondary effects that could ruin your whole innovation. And as I've said, evaluation in innovation is absolutely crucial, from metacognition, talking about your ideas to other people, to developing and right through to the implementation. I really like this ancient Chinese proverb. When the winds blow, some people build walls, others build windmills. And I think we're pretty much at that point in society now. We were complaining earlier about the fact that we're always online, always just communicating by technology. Well, let's not just build those walls, but windmills to change the whole thing. So I hope you have a lot of questions about what I've told you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Janice, for this inspirational thoughts. And yes, I do have some questions, but I first give the floor to others. Maybe if someone would like to. Yeah, I see Milena, you raised your hand.
Yeah, so I was wondering, because at the beginning, well, first of all, thanks so much. It was really, really good and really interesting. I was wondering, because you mentioned at the beginning the top skills that we should be developing, and this gap between the ones that we already developed and the ones that we should be developing. And I remember that I've been looking at this list, and before it was top 10, now it's top 15, top 20, it's changing every 5 years. And think about skills like open-mindedness, for example. I'm wondering, because it takes time really to develop this sort of thing. So I actually have two thoughts on that. First of all, is it the responsibility of us as lifelong learners, as individuals, to develop this kind of things? Or is it a systematic responsibility? So shall we require it from our governments and from people who provide us with the information and then education to teach us this kind of things? And the other question would be how to choose what we should learn.
Okay, would you like me to respond to questions one at a time, or?
I think, yeah, that could work, Janice, if you agree.
Okay, so whose responsibility is it? Well, in an ideal world, it would be the responsibility of parents. But how do parents know these things? All parents are not equal in the way they're able to help their children, which is why, although we used to start school around age 6, now it's 3 or it's 4 to give every child this social opportunity. Open-mindedness is something. If a child comes from a family with a narrow mind, if I can say, open-mindedness is very difficult to create. And we only create it in the very early years through collaboration, through listening to other people's stories, by ensuring that every child gets to have his say. And little by little, in the cosmopolitan societies that we live in, open-mindedness does come into being. However, our schools, for some reason, have built walls rather than windmills. And they don't go out into the community enough. They don't take children into the community enough. And so whose responsibility is it? Well, I would say the teacher trainers. They have to change this attitude. It is so important that we start making people understand the big reason we go to school is actually so we're socialized, and being socialized in our society means that we can get a job in the future, we can understand the point of view of others, we can develop empathy, etc. So that is who, and that is how.
Can I just ask one more, if we're still,
yeah,
because that's about the kids, but if we are looking at kids in the next 5 years, then the new skills will appear and there will be completely new skills to be taught. But what about us as adults? Because we are already on the market and we also have to develop these skills, right?
That's right. And my huge fear with algorithms, and the public doesn't know enough about algorithms, is that pluralism is lost. We start looking up something on internet, and so the algorithm begins forming, and then little by little we are only seeing the information that really complies with the way we think. So I think we have a big job to do in forcing industry to have its algorithms as an open box so that everyone can see it, so that there is really a control on this. At the moment, it's the Wild West. We are not getting the information that we need because we're being profiled. So yes, adults have to develop it. If you have a normal social life, you will develop it. If you go into the workforce, you'll be working with people different than yourself. You'll also be developing it. But let me tell you that open-mindedness is not new. I mean, we speak about this 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. So it's not a new idea, but because of the impact of social media, it's an idea that is really moving up towards the top. We're suddenly aware that it's hard to be open-minded when industry is fighting against us.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And then I see Italo, you raised your hand.
Yes, thank you, Janice. I'd like to ask you something. Since you've been around a lot, you've been working within companies and governments, so it's, you have a very broad perspective on things in education and innovation. I also work with companies and schools and my own government in Sweden. But one thing that I find, two of the things that they don't really go together, innovations and school, they're not too in a sense, they don't really match the way companies would like to do innovations with education, EdTech products and so forth, but the schools are slow. They are, at least in Sweden, very not keen to bring in innovations, and maybe not prepared even teachers or principals to take in innovations and do something of an effect with it. What's your experience of working with the different governments and different organizations?
Well, a few years back, industry, I think was a group of 10 different companies, asked me to do research on innovation in schools, because yes, innovation is difficult in schools. And there are a few really interesting things that we found. One is, if you want to be innovative in a school, don't target the young teachers who were already struggling with all the difficulties of teaching. They may be really strong users of technology. However, they are not able to integrate these things by themselves into the classroom. So target the 50+ teachers who really know how to teach, they can take risks. The second thing we learned is that you can't just have one teacher to integrate technology. So all of the projects that I run now, we have at least 2 teachers, and usually 2 teachers in a series of, say, 3 or 4 schools, with one ambassador who links with us and links with those teachers, because it's hard to innovate alone. You need support, you need scaffolding, which is something that we do learn. Next, I think that the exam systems are really not made for innovation. They cut any form of innovation. You may innovate for the first half of the year, and then we've got exams to do. I don't know who's familiar with Ivan Illich. He wrote a really wonderful book, I think it's called Schools Out, way back in the 50s. And he dreamt of a way of educating, which schools could do, and which I'm amazed that they haven't done with the COVID crisis. He suggested that kids of different ages should be able to work together on the thing they love, for example, astronomy, with an astronomer, and they can come together a couple of times a week and meet that astronomer, but a real expert, not a teacher who's trying to teach something they don't really understand. But through this love of one subject area, by learning from an expert who's out in the field and is not trying to teach something he doesn't know, it totally opens up the way children learn, and they can learn maths from astronomy, they can learn geography, history. You can learn any subject, you can learn all the things we're meant to learn at school by having a great big interest in one subject and working with experts, and then the teachers can fill in the gaps. So you're right, it's a huge problem. I wish someone would take up this idea of Ivan Illich and really change education, and not just try and add a bit of technology here and there and think they're changing it. And it's very hard to move without a school leader who understands why you should innovate And this is why a lot of schools now are actually getting a business person to be the head of school rather than a school teacher who's gone up in the various grades and becomes a principal. So I don't know if I've given you some hints on how to help innovation. It is a problem, but we really have to think holistically, and we're not doing it at present.
I'm not sure about the if the expert is actually a person that knows how to teach. So I'm not sure about, but I would definitely, if you write on the chat the name of the book, I'd love to read it. Just because you're an expert, it's not like you can actually give your knowledge to others so simply. So that's the dilemma with the teachers and the experts. But one thing that struck me, like you said, you have to get, like you said, if it's too young, it still not have the role of the teacher in part of the person. So it's still thinking about how to teach. But if you get someone too old, then maybe then doesn't know how to use the technology. So it's like we have to get the teacher somewhere in the middle-aged teachers. And that's was the interesting things that you said. Maybe someone in the middle age who understands technology, but still feels comfortable about being a teacher, the role as a teacher. So that's a good thing, because we are preparing some systemic changes in different schools. And that's one thing definitely I will take with me, try to find someone has within himself or herself the role as a teacher, so doesn't have to think about how to do things anymore, but still knows a little bit about technology that can introduce it into the school, because we find it very difficult. I mean, our teachers, I don't know, they just don't want to, even the younger ones.
I think, though, we have to remember that you cannot teach anyone anything.
Yeah.
Teaching is putting the knowledge out there. The trick is to develop these learning to learn strategies. And so a teacher, we have this old idea that I have to make them listen to me, and an expert can't teach us, but an expert can inspire us. Inspiration and motivation is what draws us in, and we learn despite ourselves. And so I think that we have to keep that in mind, that it's all about inspiration. And of course, you need a teacher who knows how to teach children division, for example, because it's something that you're really going to need. I have an interesting experience, if I may just share this little one, when I was working in Australia with the Aboriginals. No, it was in a normal classroom, but there were Aboriginal children in the classroom. One, I did not know that these children had been stolen from their families and were with foster families. And so I didn't really understand the context. But two, I didn't understand that not everyone has the capacity for abstract thinking. So a real teacher has to put themselves into the shoes of the learner, look at the learner's experience, and then through a scaffolding type of mechanism, keep pushing them out that little bit further. But you can't take a person in from one context and throw them into the other. You cannot teach an Aboriginal division if you don't take out some stones or some oranges and put them into piles and show what it means. So I think it's also important to remember that.
I think that Alison, you would like to react on in same line. Is that correct? Because there was also a question from Alberto in the chat, but that's about a different topic. But
thank you so much, Janice. So much food for thought that you've given us there. And I think reflecting on some of those important themes that you brought in there, I think we always have this dilemma around whether we go for revolution or evolution. And, always I think we want now's the point, we must have the revolution. This must somehow change. And I, like you, have worked predominantly with teachers and technology for 30 years. And I know that it is a very slow evolution that that takes years and years and years, and it's a mindset that we all have to come to be flexible and open to innovation, whether it's technological innovation, pedagogical innovation. So setting that to one side, one of the big potential transformations is through the assessment system. And you mentioned exams, and it's like they are the elephant in our room, in that they dictate so much of what goes on in classrooms because they are so high stakes and so important. What would you do? I mean, what would you revision assessment to be that meant that we still had space for innovation, because the teachers aren't only concerned with getting the best for their students and helping them to get the best results they can?
So I think the only form of evaluation that really works is progressive evaluation, continued evaluation. And they say that the class teacher gets biased and it may not be a good form of education. But when I was teaching instructional design, I took another approach, and it was very interesting. I asked my students, okay, university students, to evaluate themselves and give themselves the mark that they thought they deserved. And I was really amazed. People always under-evaluate themselves. They give themselves a lower mark, and it makes them realize what they haven't learned, and so where the effort needs to be placed. So I would say that if we were really innovative, we could think about some form of self-evaluation with the guidance of a teacher. But why do we keep kids locked in a class at the same age level when they're capable of doing much more? Why do we decide that you go to university at 18 when there are some who can go at 16? So innovation is certainly the elephant in the room. We need a group of educators like yourself to sit down and think about it and propose really another way to go about this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we still have time for Alberto and his question. Alberto, you've put it already in the chat, but maybe it's nice to put it here live to Janice. Alberto?
Yes,
oh,
sure.
Yeah. Oh,
Thank you very much, Janice, for your presentation. I really liked it. And I had like this question that I would like to ask you. And from your presentation, I understood that like there should be a harmonization in how we teach youngsters, right? And we should try to evolve, especially in Europe and so on. And I would like to ask you whether you think that having people in companies with different backgrounds in education that may think differently is enriching for companies, or it would be better to proceed with this harmonization in education and have like everyone with similar values, skills.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think the voice of Albert
Just cut out, I think, last minute. I think I got his question.
Okay,
Alberto,
great.
thank you for your question. Sorry, I don't have that American approach. I know they say that's a very good question. I forget to do it each time. I'm too natural. Harmonization. In fact, this is one of the big things that came up with the companies. Now, I've interviewed, Facebook, Google, my usuals, KPMG, Deloitte. And the thing that comes up is the great value of having trainees in the company. We think that they really find that it's an underpaid part of the workforce that can get work done without paying. No. It's a very important way for companies to get a different age group coming in, different ideas coming in, to get innovative ideas that young people have, which were quite different than we have when we're older. And so all of the companies, without fail, every one of them that I've interviewed have underlined the importance of having a lot of different sorts of people in the company from different backgrounds, and making sure that you get enough trainees, PhD students, whatever, coming in to keep stirring that pool of diversity. So it is a good question, Alberto, because this diversity in companies, in fact, in Denmark, they're trying to set up a forum where they can figure out how to get an even greater diversity. So it's vital, diversity.